Hey all, this is part 2 of chapter 12, non-chord tones 1 for music theory 2. I wanted to do a video now of some analysis and then also in part to do some examples on one, how to write out suspensions or how to create suspensions in a texture that doesn't have them, and then also talk a little bit about how to embellish a texture that may not have any non-chord tones. So I'm using the material listed here in self-test 12.2 because I think this is a good place to start with this. You'll have a packet that you can work on, and so of course use this for extra exercise, and I think there's also some exercises in the workbook as well. So let's start here. This is 12.2 number 3, and so you can follow along if you want. But I'll go ahead and label this. All right, so this is in the key of E flat major. And I'll just keep it in blue. And I'm just going to go through and label my chords. But I want to label them in a way so that you kind of understand how to go through and recognize non-chord tones as they're appearing. Often in chorale settings like this, the non-chord tones will be clear because they're often occurring off of the beat, although not always. Sometimes we'll have accented non-chord tones. But you will need to kind of weed through and decide what notes belong to the chord and what notes don't belong to the chord. More often than not, you'll figure out what chords belong by repetition, duration, and then, what notes are seeming to be added on rhythmically or maybe are different than we've seen in other parts of the texture. That's especially the case for chorales here too. Okay, so let's go through and label this. This is a 1 chord. Well, sorry, let me play this for you first, and then we'll label. Little chorale here in E flat. So we have a 1 chord here. Okay, and now we have a 5 chord. We have B, E, B flat, D, F, but then we also have this added A flat. Now there are 2 ways of going about this. You could say, oh, that's a 5/7 chord. Or you could say, hey, this is a 5 chord and this note right here is a passing tone. As you can see, approached by step, left by step in the same direction, passing tone. I'm going to label it a passing tone. Since it doesn't sound with the rest of the chord, it's sounding after the chord, I don't really get the sense of 5/7. I get more of the sense of a passing tone because of how that note is moving through to the next harmony. All right, next chord is 6, minor 6, and 5/6. And then here, we have E flat, G, and B flat all on the first part of this beat, right? And so I think that's a big indicator to us that that's a 1 chord. And then here we have some non-chord tones, so they don't belong to this harmony inside this beat. And these, if you'll look, are both passing tones approached by step, left by step, same direction. Yes. And then we're going to the same chord essentially, E flat, G, B, but this time this is in first inversion because that G is the lowest note. And the A flat here is not a chord tone, again, passing tone. Yes? All right, now a little bit more to think about here in this chord. So the notes I see in this chord are B flat, I see an F, I also see an E flat and an A flat. Now when you listen to that chord, does that sound like a triad to you? Or a 7th chord? Not quite. But when we get to that 4th beat where we have the D in there, then it starts to sound a little bit more like a triad. So you can't have the blinders on. You can't only look here. You instead have to look here, right? You're going to have to look at a bigger space to understand what's going on. So if we took into consideration all of these notes and added the D in here, then we would see B flat D F A is a 5-7 chord, right? And now we can contend with that E flat and kind of figure out what it's doing inside this chord. Okay, so here's a big hint to you. This note has been held through from the previous chord. So you should the suspension flag should be going up. Here's your prep. Oops, that was not written very well. I'm going to draw a line to this to make my life a little easier. Here's your prep on E flat. Now this becomes a suspension. E flat is not a chord tone in our 5-7 chord. Prep, suspension, and then resolution downward by step means it is a suspension. Now we have some extra stuff going on down here. This E flat down here is not a suspension, but rather it's a neighbor tone. Lower neighbor in this case, right? So we have the F chord tone, E flat non-chord tone, F. So approach by step, left by step in the opposite direction. So let's still talk about that suspension above because we have to label our figures. So let me get rid of a couple of things because this is getting awfully cluttered. Let me use a different color here too. I'm going to use yellow. So if we look at our lowest note, our bass note, compared to our suspension note, E flat, that distance is a 4th. Okay, so bass note compared to non-chord tone or suspension. Now we need to look at the bass note compared to our resolution, which is D. B flat to D is a 3rd. So we would classify this as a 4-3 suspension. Now let me get rid of some of this stuff. I got a lot of stuff going on here. If I was just writing this out, I would want to write it something like this. Here's my suspension, and I might write somewhere below 4-3, something like that, yeah? And I'm sorry, there's a lot of clutter in there, but I just wanted to kind of show you how I was analyzing this. Now this can be kind of confusing because you have that lower neighbor in there. But definitely a suspension. We have all 3 parts, prep, suspension, and resolution. Here's a 1 chord here. I'm going to keep trucking along, 5-6. 1. This is an A flat, C, E flat chord. So this is a 4-6 chord with that C in the bass. The D doesn't belong to our A flat chord. This is in fact a passing tone. Approach by step, left by step. Okay, here we have a 1 chord with some passing notes again. Again, D and F don't belong to our E flat, G, B flat chord, and so these are passing. And when you have thirds like that passing, you can put them all in parentheses. You don't have to put them in individual parentheses for each note. It's fine to put them as a group and call them passing tones. Our next chord is a 4 chord again. And again, we have these passing notes that go back up to a 1-6 chord. Oops, that's supposed to be 1-6. Our E flat GB, B flat, excuse me. And then again, we have an A down here passing. And finally, we have sort of the same thing going on here. As you can see here, if we're looking at this, there's a lot going on. If we listen to it, right there on beat 2 is where it seems to stabilize, right? Where it actually sounds like a chord that we recognize. So again, don't put the blinders on. You got to look at the whole thing here. So if we take all of this together, we have these notes, B, flat, D. We also have that E flat in there, but we're going to recognize that as a non-chord tone, F and A flat. We also have a G hanging out in here, but if you look at this closely, this definitely looks like a neighbor tone here. So what are our chord tones? B flat, D, F, A. So I think, again, this is a 5-7 chord. Get rid of that square there. So this E, what is this E? Well, we have our prep here, prep. That's held through, it becomes a suspension, a non-chord tone. And then it resolves down by step. So this is definitely a suspension. Okay, if we're comparing our bottom notes here, our bass note, and I'm going to use yellow again to help us out. Erase some of this stuff. This is our bass note here. Compare it to our suspension note. That's a fourth. B flat to E flat is a fourth. And then B flat to our resolution, which is D, is a third. So we would describe this as a 4-3 suspension with that neighbor tone hanging out underneath again. And finally, we have a 1 chord. And as you can see here, we have a perfect authentic cadence here and an imperfect authentic cadence here because we don't have that tonic pitch in the soprano voice, but we do have root motion in both voices. So let me play this again. There's that suspension. And those suspensions are happening right at those cadence points, right? We want that tension, that feeling of inhale and then the exhale, the release, the resolution happening on our 1 chord. So that suspension helps make that lift or that preparation for our cadence, our final cadence chord, that much more sort of anticipating what's to come, right? Or setting up that stable 1 chord even that much more. So this exercise is actually asking you to go through and to write this passage without the non-chord tones. So I'm not going to give you a lot of this, but I did want to give you measure 2 because I thought that would be interesting to show how this might appear without the non-chord tones in a simplified texture. So keeping what we have here, if we take out our non-chord tones on beat 1, we're left with this. And this E is doubled down here. E flat's double. Right? And then beat 2, we have this. We're going to take out that passing A flat. Yeah? And then beat 3 here, we don't want the suspension. So we're just going to directly write our D down here. We'll make it a half note. And our A up here. So no E suspension. The E stays the same. Or excuse me, the E moves down to a D natural. And then we won't keep our neighbor tone down here to E flat. So we're actually just leaving F down here and to B flat down here. And that's actually the simplification of what we have. No neighbor tone, no suspension. And then finally we of course resolve to here. So let's hear those two, the simplified and the non-simplified version of this. So here's the non-simplified version with the passing tones and suspension. And now here's the simplified version below. Obviously the one with non-chord tones is much more interesting, right? Especially that suspension. You have to love suspensions there. Okay, good. So that's an example of an analysis and then just a little bit of reduction. So we're reducing the texture down to just its harmonies. No non-chord tones there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about suspensions. This is B. After reviewing the discussion of embellishments, decide what one suspension would best in each of the following excerpts. Then renotate the suspension and at least one other embellishment. Remember to put the parentheses around the non-chord tone. So I'm not gonna add any extra. I'm not gonna add any extra non-chord tones. Let's just talk about what suspensions you could add through here. So let's look at the first one. Hear the texture real quick. And this is the first one, 1, 6, 5, 6, and finally 4. Okay, so for suspensions, we know that a suspension needs a preparation, a suspension, and a resolution, down by step. So what we're looking for is a chord tone in one chord that can be then held through the next chord, into the next chord, and that will then resolve down by step. And so really what we're looking for in any of our voices is stepwise motion downward. I'm not going to say in any of our voices. Usually it's the upper voices. So stepwise motion downward from one chord tone to the next. If we have that, then we can write in a suspension. All right, and in this example, there's really only one place we can do that. And you'll see it here in our alto voice, F moving to E. So imagine now that this F is not going to be moving to E right away, but is rather held through and then resolved down to the E. Okay, so the F is a preparatory note, then becomes the suspension, F non-chord tone in our 5 chord, and is then resolved down. And so if we write that out, not too hard to write this out. I'm going to keep my blue here. So here's all of our chord tones. We'll keep the half note here, but then when we get over here, we're going to write this as a quarter note, right? So here's our prep, here's our suspension, here's our chord tone G, and we'll put this in parentheses here. And here's our E, so there's the E, and notice it becomes a quarter note here, and that's fine, it's our resolution, it's our chord tone. So suspension here. Now, what kind of suspension do we have in terms of figures? Well, C, our lowest note compared to F, is a 4th, and then C compared to our resolution is a 3rd. So we would call this a 4/3 suspension. It's quite nice, yes? So suspensions really can only be added where we have stepwise motion downward in any of our voices, mostly the upper voices. So if we don't have that stepwise motion, then it's not possible to do a suspension. Our suspension needs to resolve by step down, only by step down. Of course, if you have stepwise motion up, that could be a potential spot where you could write a retardation. Okay. Let's look at one more. I'm not going to finish that example. You can look at it on your own. Let's look at one more here. Let's look at this one over here. This next one, F sharp minor. And it sounds like this. Okay, again, if we're going to add a suspension, we need stepwise motion downward, right? The only place where we have that, in this case, is in the bass. Everything else is stepwise up. Now, you could add a retardation in any of these or here, but remember our resolution for suspension is down. So how would that work? Well, just like it's worked before. We'll keep all of our chord tones up here. And then as we move on to our next chord, we'll keep all the chord tones here. But this note will be suspended through, held through. And in order to fit the rhythm here, we're going to have to make these 8th notes. We'll continue on here. And voila. And notice where my 8th note is beamed. It starts on this beat and is beamed forward. A typical mistake would be to beam this backwards this way to this note, and that is not correct. We always want to beam through into the next beat, not behind the beat. Okay, so prep, suspension here, and finally the E sharp is our resolution. So how would this sound? Remember, so I don't have to go into a lot of detail here, bass suspensions are always 2/3 suspensions, and I'll write that in for you, 2/3 suspensions. The number's getting larger because our fixed note, our suspension note is moving down and away from our fixed note. And so that means the interval grows here instead of getting smaller. So we would describe this suspension as a 2/3 suspension. Again, looking for that downward stepwise motion, and that's where you could insert a suspension into the texture. All right, let us now go down to embellishing. And you will have to do this for homework, and so I just kind of wanted to give you a quick example of this. So here you have this texture. Well, that note wasn't right there at the end. Let me play it one more time. Nice, okay. So, now, some things to think about. We already talked about suspension. In order to have a suspension, you need to have that stepwise motion downward, right? Usually in upper voices, but it can be in a bass voice. To have a retardation, you need to have the stepwise motion upward, right? Okay, so we already know that. We did that before. Now, what about passing tones and neighbor tones? What do we need? Well, with a neighbor tone, all we need is a repeated pitch, a repeated chord tone. So let me give you an example. Right down here, we have an F and an F. It would be very easy to insert a neighbor tone right there. Boom. Or excuse me, E flat in this case. So neighbor tones need repeated chord tones, and then we can insert a neighbor tone right in between there. What about passing tones? Well, remember, passing tone is stepwise motion descending. So passing tones really need a distance of a third between two chord tones. So where would that be? Where do we have a distance of a third between two chord tones? Right here, you have distance of a third. Right here, you have distance of a third. Where's some other spots? Right here, you have a distance of a third. Here, here, here. Those are all spots you could put passing tones. Because think about that, passing tone has to be in between those two notes to embellish it. So let's take this example over here that I just pointed to. You could potentially put a passing tone there, put a passing tone there, F, put a passing tone on D, and then put a passing tone on B flat here. And now, instead of this, oops, sorry, there it is. Now with the passing tones, you might have passing tones in between here. Passing, passing, passing. You label them P, P, and P. So passing tones have to have that third between chord tones so you can insert a note in between, right? And the neighbor tones just have to be the same chord tone, and we can go up or down to create a neighbor tone. Suspensions, we need that stepwise motion. And so from here, it's up to you to embellish, and of course you would write that out down here in this context. Or in this context, on this staff. I would say be careful not to overdo the non-chord tones. You want to be simplistic, yet you want to add enough chord tones to make it interesting. So what I would say not to do is don't put chord tones in all four of your voices on one beat. That's too much. Yes? Think about putting chord tones, non-chord tones on every beat, every other beat maybe, or you can even have some measures where it's just on one of the beats. So be simple about it, right? Notice as we approached cadence points, our non-chord tones, we had more non-chord tones. Our texture became more active, more embellished in order to prepare us for that final arrival, usually of a perfect authentic cadence. So have fun embellishing the textures. I think it's interesting, but use these tips to help you do so.